All right. Why do I need a manual for my router? Look, reading any manual sounds boring to me, so I hope you have a good answer for this one. What's the first step in accessing my router? Again, this is a fair question because I, I would say manually pick it up. Like, uh, how many passwords are there for my home network? Oh, man. Dude, really? More passwords? You know
Well, you
how?
just, yeah, we're not going to add any. We're just going to
Oh,
make you aware of them.
okay. Okay. Good. I was worried about that. You know how I feel about passwords.
Yeah.
What are the two methods for connecting a router? With a cable? Wirelessly? Is that the
Yeah.
answers you're looking for?
Well, that's a good answer. That's a totally valid, correct answer. Uh, that's just my bad on how I phrased the question because that is not the question I was intending to ask, but a perfectly reasonable interpretation. So we'll rephrase that question once we get to that section and make sure it's clear what we're talking about there.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Okay, well, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. I'm Nick, and this is Super Simple Security Principles. Listen each week and learn how to think, not what to think. This is episode 54, and we're continuing on with safeguarding our home, how to access your router. So, Makani, this sounds incredibly complex to me. You're going to be able to keep it simple, right?
Well, I'm glad you said that because, as you know, I always share, kind of my notes beforehand, have Cam review them for accuracy, for feedback, all those kind of things.
Yeah.
And that's basically what he said. He's like, dude, I don't know. This seems like a scary one to tackle. I think lots of people might be too scared to do this. I'm like, well, fair enough. I mean, so we talked about it a little bit, and my perspective, at least, is this at this point. Um, we want to have more step-by-step guides for it to help people work through this, right? We're gonna start here, but it's far from gonna be ending here.
Okay.
So, if we come to the end of this episode and you're listening and it's still too scary to tackle, that's fine. I'm not worried because it's still the right place to start because we're going to teach some foundational principles and see if that's enough to, get you so you can do it on your own. And again, if not, that's fine. And if you don't feel ready, but you want like that you're wanting to now though,
Yeah.
you can always come to the forum for some more help and see if we can get you there. Uh, and we have a small enough, listener base still right now that, if you need some one-on-one help, that might even be an option. So,
Way to steal my thunder, man. I was going to say
oh,
if they
sorry.
have questions after, reach out to us on our forum. But well said. Thank you.
Yeah,
We would. We'd love to hear from you. Again, for our listeners, please know I am not the expert here. I learn alongside with you, so hopefully we can learn together, and that's what I'm kind of looking forward to in today's show. Is look, routers sound incredibly complex, and when we start saying where's the manual, I go, do I want to know this? Do I want to know this, or is this something I just want to stay oblivious to? So
yeah,
if I can, let's dive right in and what's the importance? Why do I need the manual for my router?
yeah. Well, so stepping back just a little, even before that, and we've been talking about this in the past few episodes of how critical the router is to the security of your home network, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It,
And it's
we want to
yeah,
stop the incoming calls on it, right?
exactly. Yep, it's the gatekeeper for all the devices in your home.
Yeah.
And so if it's going to do its job properly, we've got to make sure it's configured correctly,
Okay.
which
That
I'm
makes
sure
sense.
sounds even more scary, right? But
I thought it as kind of like a sports analogy, right? I'm like, okay, if we're going to have a game, we need to have certain players play certain positions and have a game plan. And so for my router, especially where I'm using it to help block incoming calls, I need to make sure that I have a game plan for my router, that I have plays in place, that I have, as you said, configuration correct in what I need to do to protect myself. Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and just to maybe try to lower the scare factor a little bit is um, when we'll go through this in more detail later. But if you think about your phone, and there's the settings or preferences or whatever it's called on your particular device. You go in there and change some things from time to time,
Yeah.
right? And essentially, that's all we're going to be doing with the router. It's not like we're going to teach you to write code or there's, a lot of weird mumbo jumbo. It's just mostly a matter of getting access to your router, um, and then, toggling a few switches, putting in a couple of value. Like yeah, I don't think it's going to be too bad anyway. Maybe I'm optimistic, but we'll see.
Says the
Um,
security expert.
Yeah, well, admittedly so. But the thing is, like you said, right, we need a game plan, and basically what that boils down to, I mean, the first step, I guess, is being able to access the router.
Okay.
And so, I mean, not everybody in the house needs to be able to, but somebody at least, in my opinion. I would rather have somebody in-house rather than having to hire a computer expert um, that I don't necessarily know and trust. Uh,
Right.
if you've got one of those, great. But anyway, so that's kind of my premise. And from my perspective, if you can install an app on your phone, or if you can visit a website, if you can do those two things, not or I should say and, if you can do those two things, then I think anyway, you'll be able to do this. And I'm
Okay.
going to do my best to at least start getting you there today.
Okay. I mean, I feel like I can do that on my phone. You know?
Right. I know you can. I know enough about you. And most people I think today probably can. So
Yeah.
so now let's get to the manual.
Yeah.
And really that boils down to, I mean, the classic advice of, what do you do with something that, you don't understand or that you're complex? Read the instructions,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I know these days with Google and such quick access to information, and lots of things don't even come with a physical manual. Like reading the manual, reading instructions really has fallen out of practice in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
I acknowledge fully that it's kind of a strange thing to hear, right?
Yeah.
But it's still, I feel like, the way to start. Um,
Okay. Fair enough.
so yeah, and I debated a lot about it, but anyway, so if you search for instructions online about how to access your router, most of them you'll see are kind of similar and, in my opinion, fairly outdated. Um,
Okay. Great.
more complex than they need to be. Whatever. Like technology changes quickly, and routers are no exception. There's a lot of things that haven't changed, but there are a lot of things that have changed. And in addition, there's many different brands and types of routers, and this is one I know you are familiar with because a huge change in fairly recent years is the arrival of what's called mesh routers,
Yeah.
right? So why don't you explain what's different about your mesh router from your perspective, Nick, than the kind of router you had before? Whatever. All I can,
Nice.
but
But I'll jump in, but you're
yeah.
throwing me on the spot big time.
Oh yeah.
Okay. To our listeners, I'm not the expert, but a mesh system is where you have multiple devices that can broadcast that signal. Is that correct?
Yeah. That's the single biggest thing to understand. There's a bunch of other details, but that's the main thing that's relevant for everybody is when you put it in, it's not just one box. You're going to have them stuck around at different places, and that's part of what helps make them provide such good Wi-Fi coverage for your house because there's
I have
multiple
3.
broadcast points. Right? Yeah, you got three. Yeah, and so that's an example anyway of how routers have changed.
Yeah.
Um, but of course, what hasn't changed, even though it's not as trendy or whatever, as fashionable, is they do actually have instructions. They sometimes even have a paper manual these days, although usually it's just like a tiny quick start guide. But there's always either online instructions or a document you can download. Um, so whatever it looks like anyway, step one of accessing your router is actually getting a hold of those instructions. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in a previous episode, we talked about them locating the manual for their router.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
one of our call to actions.
yeah, okay. I was doubting myself there for a second, but yeah, I'm not crazy. Right.
Nope.
So, okay, so that's step one.
Yep.
Now, what I will say is a little caveat on those instructions. We know that sometimes instructions are not as helpful as we'd like them to be,
Yep.
right?
That's very fair. Very honest. Yeah.
So that's why we're going to talk about a couple things that might help answer questions or problems that you'll run into.
Okay. Let's hear it.
So that basically boils down to step two is what you're always going to need to access your router is the admin username and admin password.
Okay.
Okay. Now this goes back to one of our opening questions. How many passwords are there? Right.
Right.
So most times when I have explained this to somebody in person, the first thing that comes to their head is the Wi-Fi password, right? Because that's the one
Right.
that you use a lot, you remember, you probably have posted in your home, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's an important password, right? But as you know, as everybody knows, the Wi-Fi password lets you connect to the internet. That's what
Right.
lets your individual devices connect to the internet. So the router admin username and password, notice there is also a username here, whereas with the Wi-Fi, it's just a password with no username.
Okay.
So that's what you use to connect to the router and change settings on the router,
Okay.
control it, configure it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So we basically have to find our user name and password for our router.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. So, and a lot of times people don't have any idea what that is because it got set up once and
Sure.
then it's been working and then they don't need it again until they need to change something or something breaks or whatever. So it might be a very long time and so it often gets lost, I've found.
Yeah. That's what I'd probably worry about with mine.
I'd say I know we didn't end up locating yours or I can't even remember. It's been years now since we looked at that together. But anyway, here's what, for our listeners, if you don't know your router username and admin username and password, the first thing to do is, if you don't know it, is if you didn't do the setup yourself, maybe check with whoever did, and hopefully they kept track of it. And they
Okay.
can just tell you.
Yeah.
Next is, especially if you have I mean, I don't know how many, pretty recent, I mean, not that recent, I should say, actually. They've started doing this. They'll have the username and password printed on the bottom of them.
Okay.
Um, and then if you have a really old router, all routers of a certain brand or model like would ship with the same username and password. Most would have, yeah, strikes you as a bad idea, right?
Oh yeah, that sounds like a terrible idea.
Oh yeah, there have been a lot of problems over the years because of that.
I bet.
Yep. And well, and then you combine that with then enabling remote administration that we talked so much about, right?
Yeah. You could get
And
somebody to completely take over.
yeah, and that's what happened because the username is usually admin and the password was something simple like admin also or password or right. Terrible idea. You can go actually. There's a website. We'll put it in the show notes. Routerpasswords.com that shows all the different mass defaults that have been there um, over the years. So
So can I stop you there?
please,
Because this sounds this emphasizes the point of why it's so important to understand your router and understand those things, because if you do happen to have a router that's got a generic password and generic login, like you really are more at risk. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, unless you've changed it,
Right,
right?
right, right.
Yeah,
Okay. All right, there
yeah,
you go. There's another plug for why this is so important. You
yeah.
know?
Well, and here's the good news. Like,
Okay.
I mean, I don't know how many years it's been, but the default router, like if you go buy a router today,
Mm-hmm.
it is it is pretty secure out of the box.
Okay, that's good.
Like for the most part, they are really good. They've I mean they've had so many problems over the years. They've really upped their game. Like normally you're not going to have to do anything. I mean, or very a lot less anyway. It's so much better.
Okay, good.
So yeah, I would be surprised with any decent router if it had a default username and password anymore. So
Okay.
I haven't checked all brands, but and maybe again I'm optimistic. I don't know for sure, but
Right.
anyway. So I get, and then if you still can't figure it out, again, you're welcome to come visit the forum, and we can talk through it and see if we can help you figure it out.
Right.
Uh, and then if you still can't figure it out, like we can't do it together, there's really only one solution left, and that's to do a reset on your router.
Hmm.
But basically it's usually like holding down a button for a long time or whatever. But it's super inconvenient and should be considered an extreme last resort, only if you actually need to change your router settings or you're ready to have some downtime, because it will not only reset your router administration username and password, which is what you want, right? But it's
Right.
also going to reset the Wi-Fi network name and password and all the other settings to the defaults. And
Okay.
depending on your internet provider, it might even break your connection to the internet until it's reconfigured and like require you to call your internet service provider to get reconnected. So please, before you do that, I don't want anybody to yelling at me because they followed my advice and reset their router and now their internet's broken. Like, come talk to me on the forum first, please. So
Right. I was gonna say, isn't that what happened with mine? It is when we reset my router, it killed the internet for a while.
I think you
Had to get
might
a
be
hold of
right.
my internet
I,
provider.
I, I can't remember if it was that or just because we bought you a new standalone cable modem, which is
Oh,
the piece of hardware that your ISP actually connects with.
okay.
And that's something we're going to talk about more, because routers these days usually combine a bunch of pieces of hardware. They're like a cable modem like you had, we bought separately, that's
Mm-hmm.
specific to cable internet. And then there's the part that provides Wi-Fi, and that's can be separate, and a lot of times it's just all bundled into one. So anyway, we'll talk more
Okay.
about that later, but I can't remember for sure with you, but maybe.
Fair enough.
So um, then once you know your username and password, of course, if it's a default one or if it's not a good one, please update it to a strong, unique password, right? That's like,
Right.
we won't talk about other securing things today, but I figure while we're doing that, let's do that. And I suggest 14 characters long. Um,
Okay.
and, ideally, you'd use a password manager to generate a new one for you, and you could have even longer than that and you store it there. But if you're not there, Um, you could even write it down and tape it to the bottom of the router, as long as you're not worried about people in your own home finding it.
Okay.
So, okay, so we got some instructions. We've got a admin username and password. So the last step, and this goes to the start opening question that I asked kind of in a confusing fashion, was how you connect to the router specifically to administer it, not to connect to it for purposes of getting access to the internet. That was the clarifying point that wasn't in there.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so you can use most modern routers have an app that you can install to configure them. And that's, if they do, that's where I would probably try first because that's usually pretty simple. It's going to
Okay.
be specific. So if you have a TP-Link router, it's going to be a TP-Link app. If you have an ASUS router, if you have a Linksys, those are some of the big name ones. Um, anyway, it's going to be very specific to your brand.
Okay, perfect.
Um, so that's what I would go to first. And there are some, and like I don't personally actually use an app, but I'm a little more geeky, obviously. And but the other way is still common, and usually they support both, is just like visiting a website.
Okay.
I mean, it's visiting your router as though it were a website. So in a browser, you would type in a particular address, and it would actually not connect you to a website on the internet, but just be connecting you to the router. But the interface is like browsing a website. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
Makes sense.
Yeah, and that's the part. This is the interface where it can be. I mean, this is the place where it can be very confusing because, um, and I'm trying to think of even how to explain it without, because there's special, like a lot of times that address will be a number.
Right.
Like 192.168.1.1, up there,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And because it's not a real website, it's just your
Yeah.
router. Sometimes you'll get warnings from the browser that this is insecure, that there's like an invalid security certificate, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons why. But the short version is that because there are hacks uh, that kind of look similar. I mean, that would yield those same warnings.
Okay.
I'll explain that. Anyway, the main thing is you can ignore those warnings if you know you're actually just trying to access your router. If you encounter them at some other time when you're not trying to access your router, then you want to pay attention to those browser warnings.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. So in this instance, it's the one time where we're not going to pay attention to our browser warnings.
Yes, right. You do want
Okay.
to every other time, but yes, this is what I give you permission to. You can just ignore it because I get it every time. I've managed to work around now, but for a long, long time, I was getting a warning from my browser every time I would access my router,
Right.
which I do a lot. So,
Gotcha. I was going to say this is just one of those you can bend the rules here.
yep, because it's just
Perfect.
confused about. But anyway, hopefully you can just avoid all that and use the app because that's going to be a lot simpler for most people most of the time.
Okay. Awesome.
So, but anyway, and if you have any problems with that, again, like we've been beating that drum this whole time, uh, come visit us on the forum.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay. So, did we answer all our questions, Nick? I think we did, but you got to double check me here.
Reading through them. I think
Yep.
so.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So we already to that time of our show? Like we already
Yep.
reached our call to action?
Yep. Oh,
That was
it went
quick.
fast. Yeah. Well, we're about our kind of normal time, but I wasn't sure because we had kind of a long warm up. So if we were gonna run long on this one, but we're kind of in our normal range. So,
Yeah.
yep.
Well, and that wasn't too terribly painful either. Like I was able to get
Okay.
through that.
Okay. I was gonna say that's good because right, we were kind of talking at the start. Maybe this is really scary. And so, yeah, I'm glad you kind of reminded us of that. Of that's where you're ending right now, anyway. Not feeling too scary about it, right?
Right, right. We're just trying to access our router with a username and password so that we could configure it correctly. And I'm assuming that in our next episode, we'll even talk about more things to help configure with and steps and processes, etc.
Yep. Yeah, and
See?
actually, that reminds me of one other just small thing on the connecting. So, um, with a lot of the modern routers, and I believe this is with yours, like especially with the mesh ones,
Yeah.
the username and password you have will not be just it'll be one that's like you actually are connecting to the internet.
Hmm.
It's like a cloud-based management. And
Okay.
so, and I really kind of hate it in some ways because it means that like you're dependent on this third-party service. You know,
Right.
whoever, like the brand provider, they have a website and you have to connect to it. And then if they're down, and it has all sorts of implications, but it's really common. So just be aware that username and password might exist just on your router, but it might exist in the cloud. It might be on the internet in somebody else's, the brand's website, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah.
So anyway, okay, so I'm ready to do the call to action now.
Let's get our call to action, man. Let's do it.
So this builds on, pretty obvious, I think, from our steps here, but it builds on our call to actions from episodes 51 and 52.
Okay.
Because, there you located your router, right? Obviously, we're going to need to know that, and identified the brand and model. So and then you went to the official brand website for instructions.
Yep.
So if you haven't done those two steps, do that first. You need the instructions.
Right.
And in them, they will have instructions on how to access your router. Hopefully, that'll be pretty much telling you the name of the app to install. You'll go to your app store, install the app, enter in your username and password, and change the password to not the default, to a good strong password if you haven't. And then the last step is save your future self, that is, a headache, and make sure you don't lose that username and password because you're going to need it again at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Next
don't want to have
episode,
to
if nothing
reset.
else.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. You don't want to have to reset. And actually, I'll let you talk about the next episode, but you will need it in the next episode anyway. So,
Awesome.
so that was kind of a long one, but to do the previous ones, get the instructions, get logged in, and don't forget them. Don't forget your username and password.
That's an easy call to action. Get logged in to your router. Don't lose your username and password.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, so in next week's episode, am I allowed to talk about this already?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now that we know how to access our router, we're going to put that knowledge to good use. I say we, but realistically, we all know that it's going to be our master guardian walking us through seven critical router security settings. So remember, the reason this is so important is we are safeguarding our home here. Like this is eliminating threats at our home front. Like super important. So let's safeguard our home, our kids, figure it out together. That wasn't that painful. Our call to action was get access to your router by username and password and don't lose those. That's it. Like two simple things. So we're going to just build on what we've already talked about and actually help you understand what critical router security settings you need to have.
Thanks, Nick.
Woo!
Well, I appreciate the reminder because, just the home thing, the way you phrase that, tugs at my heartstrings a little bit anyway. You got people at your home you love, and you, yeah, you want to safeguard that stuff.
Yep,
So it's
absolutely.
so anyway. Okay, I'm ready.
All right, man, that was a good episode.
Are you ready to take action and wondering where to start? Get my Bulletproof My Identity Starter Kit for free. The 7 most vital layers of protection everyone needs. I'll send you one step at a time and help you if you get stuck. Just go to bulletproofmyid.com and enter your name and email, and I will send you the first step. Again, that's bulletproofmyid.com.